There was a particular silence that settled over the modern world, and it was not the silence of contemplation. It was the silence of a man, alone in a room, illuminated only by the cold blue glow of a small rectangle. The thumb moved, the eyes moved, the face barely moved at all. Outside the window, the sun rose and the sun set. Inside the room, time had become something stranger, a feed, an infinite scroll, a slot machine of human faces and human voices, each one demanding to be loved, feared, mocked, or forgotten in the span of 3 seconds. And then the next, and then the next, and then the next. We told ourselves that we were connected. We had never spoken to so many people. We had never seen so many strangers' lives, never been so aware of every quarrel, every triumph, every breakdown across the planet. And yet, when the rectangle was finally set down, when the screen went black and our own face appeared in the dark glass, what stared back was something we had not yet learned how to name. Something hollow, something tired, something that had forgotten how to be alone and also how to be with others. A creature of the feed. It was in this hour, this strange digital twilight, that I wanted to summon 2 ghosts, not for entertainment, not for a clever spectacle, but because I suspected that no one alive yet had the language to describe what had happened to us, while 2 men, long buried, had spent their entire lives preparing for exactly this question. They had never seen a smartphone, they had never opened a social application, and yet, decades and decades before our condition existed, they had already diagnosed it. The first was Friedrich Nietzsche, the lonely walker of Sils Maria, the hammer wielder, the prophet of the death of God, the philosopher with a mustache like a cathedral and a mind like a blade, the man who looked at modern Europe and saw, beneath its progress and its flags and its newspapers, an animal that no longer dared to suffer for anything, a herd that had forgotten how to be tragic. The second was Carl Gustav Jung, the Swiss psychiatrist who walked through dreams the way other men walk through cities, the cartographer of the soul, the one who insisted that beneath the surface of the rational ego there lived an entire ocean, archetypes, shadows, ancestors, gods. He had watched Europe go mad twice in his lifetime. He knew what the unconscious did when it was denied. Nietzsche and Jung, they had crossed paths only on the page. Jung had read Nietzsche obsessively, lectured on him for years, considered him a brother of sorts, but also a warning, a man who had stared into the abyss without the inner structure to survive it. Nietzsche, of course, had never read Jung. He had died in the dark before Jung had even begun. And yet I imagined them that night on either side of a long wooden table. 2 men who agreed on almost nothing about the cure, but who would have looked at our glowing rectangles, our trembling thumbs, our anxious refreshing, and said in one voice, "Yes, we saw this coming. We tried to warn you." The question I placed between them was simple and brutal. Has social media destroyed humanity? Nietzsche moved first. He always moved first. He did not begin with statistics. He did not begin with studies on dopamine or attention or adolescent depression. He began, as he always did, with contempt. He said that he had seen this animal before, he had described it, he had named it, and he had been laughed at. He called it the last man, the creature at the end of history who no longer aspired to anything, who wanted comfort, who wanted safety, who wanted to be liked, who blinked and said, "We have invented happiness." The last man, Nietzsche said, did not need a tyrant to enslave him. He volunteered. He did not need a priest to shame him into virtue. He shamed himself in public, in front of an audience of strangers, for fragments of approval he could not eat, could not hold, could not remember in the morning. The last man, he said, was the perfect citizen of the feed. He went further. He said that what we called connection was, in fact, the oldest sickness of mankind in a new costume. It was the herd that had always existed, the herd that, in earlier centuries, had gathered in the marketplace to throw stones at whoever the priest had named unclean. The herd that had marched behind whichever flag was loudest, the herd that had always hated the solitary man, the deviant, the one who walked alone. Social media, Nietzsche said with something close to laughter, had not invented the herd. It had merely industrialized it. It had given the herd a stadium with no walls. It had given each member of the herd the illusion that he was a voice, when in truth he was only an echo. And the morality of this herd, he said, was the morality of the weak. He had a name for it. He called it slave morality, the morality that took weakness and renamed it goodness, that took inability and renamed it virtue, that took ressentiment, the festering envy of the small soul against everything noble and strong, and dressed it up as justice. On the platforms, he said, ressentiment had finally found its perfect technology. Every wound could be displayed, every grievance could be amplified, every act of refinement, of solitude, of greatness could be brought down by 10,000 small mouths, each one telling itself that it was on the side of the good. The mob, he said, had always wanted to drag the high down to its level. Now the mob had a microphone in every pocket. He paused. And then he said, more quietly, that the worst thing was not the cruelty. The worst thing was the comfort. The last man, he reminded us, was not a villain. He was something more terrible than a villain. He was a creature without aspiration. He scrolled because scrolling required nothing of him. He outsourced his outrage because outrage in the feed was free. He outsourced his admiration because admiration in the feed cost nothing. He outsourced even his suffering because real suffering, the kind that breaks a man and reshapes him, was no longer fashionable. The last man preferred a small chronic ache to a great catastrophe. He preferred numbness to tragedy. And the platform, said Nietzsche, was the perfect machine for the production of small chronic aches. It distributed them like bread. I watched Jung listen. He did not interrupt. That was not his way. He let Nietzsche finish, the way a physician lets a patient finish describing the dream. And when he finally spoke, his voice was lower, slower, almost gentle, and what he said reframed the entire problem. He said, Friedrich, you saw it, but you did not see all of it. You saw the herd. You did not see what the herd was carrying. You called these people weak and resentful and small, and in the surface of the matter, you were not wrong. But beneath the surface, something far older was at work. Something that did not begin with the platforms. Something that did not even begin with modernity. The unconscious, he said, the collective unconscious. The deep field of images and forces that moved beneath every human life, every culture, every age. We had not abolished it by switching on our screens. We had only finally given it a stage. Jung said that what he saw when he looked at social media was not, first of all, a moral failure. It was a psychic event, a mass possession. He had watched it happen before in his own century in Germany. He had watched ordinary men, decent fathers, kind neighbors, become instruments of an archetype that had taken hold of them. He had written about it. He had warned that whenever a society stopped tending its inner life, the inner life did not disappear. It returned, autonomous, projected outward, hungry, wearing the masks of the gods we had stopped naming. The platforms, he said, were not the cause. The platforms were the medium. The cause was much older. It was the long, slow forgetting of the soul. He explained, almost patiently, what the screen had done to a person. Each human being, he said, lived with two faces. There was the persona, the mask we wore for the world, the carefully constructed presentation of self. And there was the self, the deeper center, the totality of who one truly was, much of which lived below consciousness. In a healthy life, the persona served the self. The mask was a tool. One put it on to enter the marketplace, the courtroom, the dinner party, and then, when one came home, one took it off. One had a private life, an inner life, a relationship with one's own depths. One dreamed, one reflected. One sat in silence long enough to be visited by what one had repressed, by what one had forgotten, by what was trying to become real in oneself. And then, he said, came the platform. And the platform did something that no priest, no king, no propagandist had ever quite achieved. The platform asked every human being to wear the mask all the time, to curate the persona every hour, every minute, to present, to perform, to be seen. There was no longer a backstage. There was no longer a private theater in which one could be undignified or uncertain or simply unwatched. The self, starved of solitude, began to atrophy. The persona fed constantly, began to inflate, until at last the human being identified entirely with the mask, and the mask became the only thing that felt real. We were not, he said, becoming more ourselves. We were becoming our profiles, and the unconscious, denied its inward room, did what it always did. It came out anyway. It came out as projection. It came out as the shadow, the disowned dark of every human personality splashed across the timeline. Every quality we had refused to face in ourselves we found magnified in the enemy of the weak. Every cruelty we feared in our own heart we located in the stranger we had never met. Every hunger we could not admit we condemned in someone else's post. The platforms, said Jung, were the largest engine of shadow projection in human history. They had not made us evil. They had made it impossible for us to remain ignorant of the evil we were doing. And we had decided collectively to remain ignorant anyway. We simply blamed someone else every day, forever. There was a long quiet between them. Outside somewhere a phone vibrated, and somewhere a thumb obeyed. Then Nietzsche pushed back. He said that Jung's mythology, his archetypes, his collective unconscious, was only the old priestly trick in a new laboratory coat. He said that whenever a man wanted to escape responsibility for his own smallness, he invented a force greater than himself and blamed it, the gods, the stars, the unconscious, the algorithm. It was always the same move. The herd loved nothing more than to be told it was possessed, because possession, he said with a bitter smile, did not require any work. He insisted that what was happening on the platforms was not a tragedy of forgotten gods. It was a comedy of forgotten will. People scrolled, he said, because they had not chosen anything, because they had not undertaken the long, painful labor of becoming who they were. Self-overcoming, he reminded Jung, was not optional. A human being who refused it did not become innocent. He became furniture. He went on more sharply now. He said there was a phrase he had written in Zarathustra long ago which he had never expected to be so literally fulfilled. Flee, he had written, into your solitude. Flee from the flies of the marketplace. The flies, those small biting creatures who buzzed around every great spirit, who could not create, but who could swarm, who could not build, but who could feed on whatever was bleeding. He said that he had not lived to see the marketplace become infinite. He had not lived to see the flies given wings of light and addresses and audiences and the power to find you anywhere on earth, in any hour, even in your own bed, even in your own thought. The platforms, he said, had abolished the possibility of solitude as a refuge. There was no longer any door one could close. There was no longer any forest one could enter. The flies followed. The marketplace had eaten the wilderness. And he said something else, and his voice grew almost grave. He said that what frightened him most was not that human beings were unhappy on these platforms. Unhappiness, he said, was the oldest companion of greatness. Unhappiness had built cathedrals. Unhappiness had written tragedies. Unhappiness had carved out, in the bone of suffering, every meaning a human civilization had ever produced. No, he said, the danger was not unhappiness. The danger was something subtler, something newer. It was a kind of unhappiness that no longer knew it was unhappy, a discontent that mistook itself for entertainment, a despair that wore the costume of distraction. The platform, he said, had taught modern man to feel bad in a way that would not even produce a poem. And a suffering that produced nothing, he said quietly, was the worst kind of suffering of all. It was suffering that had been wasted. Jung answered, without raising his voice. He said that the image of the flies of the marketplace was perhaps the most accurate sentence Nietzsche had ever written, and also the most painfully unfinished, because Nietzsche himself, he said, was the proof of his theory. He said, Friedrich, you of all people, you collapsed in a street in Turin, weeping over a horse. You spent your last years in a darkness from which no philosophy could save you. You stared into the abyss, and the abyss stared back, and you had no container for what looked back at you. You called for the Übermensch, and you were destroyed by what you called. You did not have a religion to hold what came up out of you. You did not have a community of meaning. You had only your own genius, and your own genius was not enough. He paused. He said, almost tenderly, "This is what is happening now to millions. They are being asked to bear alone, with no symbolic structure, with no inner relationship to the depths. The full pressure of an unconscious that they have been taught to deny exists. Of course they are breaking. Of course they are anxious. Of course they are depressed. They are Nietzsches, without genius, without writing, without pen, only thumb. The abyss has come for them too, and they have nothing in their hands but a screen." Nietzsche did not flinch. He said that pity was the last temptation. He said that this softness, this medicalizing of what was in fact a failure of nerve, was precisely the thing that kept modern man weak. He said that suffering was not an illness to be managed. Suffering was the school. Suffering was the great sculptor. The platforms, he insisted, were terrible not because they hurt us, but because they stole the meaning from our hurt. They turned every wound into a performance. Every breakdown became content. Every grief became a thread. He said, "You cannot become a self in front of a million strangers. You can only perform a self. And a performed self is not a self. It is a costume worn by a ghost." Jung said, "Yes, and yet you would have the mass of human beings climb out of the pit by their own teeth, and most of them have no teeth left, because the platform has been pulling them out for years." He said that what humanity needed was not more contempt. It needed reconnection to the symbolic life, to dream, to myth, to rituals that had real weight, to silence, real silence, the kind in which the soul could finally speak. Modern man, he said, had not lost his soul had lost him. It was waiting, exiled, in a country he no longer visited. I asked them, both of them, what they thought we were becoming. Nietzsche answered first, and his answer was cold. He said we were becoming a species of ironists who could no longer be moved by anything. We had seen too much, too quickly, too cheaply. The image of a war and the image of a cat were now the same size on the same screen, separated by half a second. We had cultivated, without noticing, an immunity to depth. We could be entertained, we could be enraged, we could be flattered, but we could no longer be transformed. The platforms, he said, were producing a generation that had had every emotion simulated for it before it had a chance to feel any of them sincerely. They had grieved before they had loved. They had been outraged before they had been wronged. They had been loved by strangers before they had been loved by themselves. Such a creature, he said, could not produce a culture. It could only produce a brand. Jung answered second. He spoke about gods. He said that whenever a culture lost its connection to the sacred did not disappear. It returned in pathological forms: compulsion, addiction, mass hysteria, apocalyptic fantasy. He said that the platforms were already full of false gods. Influencers as priests, outrage as ritual, the algorithm as oracle. These were not jokes. These were the old religious instincts of the human animal, denied their proper objects, attaching themselves to whatever flickered. He said the danger was not that we would become atheists. The danger was that we would become idolaters without knowing it. We would worship all day and never admit what we worshiped. And the price of unconscious worship, he reminded us, was always the same. Oh, the God you do not name will eat you. We had built in the span of 2 decades a temple bigger than any cathedral, brighter than any altar, attended every waking minute by every human being with a thumb. And we had sworn all the while that it was only a phone. It was at this point that I understood the question I had asked them: has social media destroyed humanity? Was the wrong question. They both, in their different ways, were telling me that humanity could not be destroyed by a tool. Humanity could only be revealed by one. The platforms had not invented the herd. The platforms had not invented the persona. The platforms had not invented projection, ressentiment, the hunger for distraction, the terror of solitude. These were ancient. The platforms had only pulled them out of the shadows into the light, at scale, at speed, all at once, in every pocket on Earth. We were not looking at a new species. We were looking at the oldest species we had ever been, finally without the cover of distance. Nietzsche, near the end, said something I did not expect. He said that he had always loved humanity, and that this was perhaps the secret of his anger. He said, "I am not a destroyer. I am a doctor with a hammer, and I tap, and I listen, because where the sound is hollow, there is rot, and the rot must be named." He said the platforms had given us for the first time the chance to hear how hollow we had become. That sound, he said, that constant low hum of anxiety, that compulsion to refresh, that emptiness after an hour of scrolling, that was the hollow sound. That was the diagnosis. The question was whether anyone was still capable of hearing it. Jung closed almost like a priest. He said that the soul could not be healed at scale, only one human being at a time. He said that no platform, no policy, no philosophy would save the modern person. The work was inward. It always had been. He spoke of the slow, lifelong task he had named individuation, the laborious becoming of the whole self, the patient dialogue with one's own depths, the willingness to face the shadow rather than project it, the courage to outgrow the persona without abandoning it. He said this work could not be performed in public. It could not be uploaded. It could not be liked. It could only be lived, mostly in silence, mostly unwitnessed, mostly without applause. It was, he said, the least photogenic thing a human being could do, and it was the only thing that had ever made a human being real. The conversation did not so much end as fade. The two men did not shake hands. They had not agreed. Nietzsche still believed in the hammer. Jung still believed in the dream. But they had agreed, perhaps for the first time, that something had gone wrong in the deepest layer of modern life, and that the rectangle in our hands was not the cause, but the mirror. We had not been broken by the platforms. We had been exposed by them, and exposure, without inner work, did not heal. It only intensified. The herd grew louder, the persona grew thicker, the shadow grew darker, and the last man, somewhere in a bedroom at 3 a.m, kept scrolling, certain that the next post, the next video, the next stranger's face would finally fill what nothing on a screen had ever been built to fill. I sat for a long time after they were gone. The window had darkened. The room was quiet. My own phone lay face down on the table, and I noticed, with a small shock, how much effort it took to leave it that way. That small effort, I thought, that tiny refusal. Perhaps that was where everything began. Perhaps every great cultural transformation in history had begun in some equally small, equally invisible decision, in some equally lit room, in some equally tired person who had simply chosen for one evening to be alone with himself, without a feed, without a witness, without applause. Nietzsche would have called it the first act of self-overcoming. Jung would have called it the first step of individuation. Neither of them would have called it social. Neither of them would have called it heroic. They would have called it necessary. They would have called it the beginning. And so I leave you, as they left me, with the question that was never really about the platforms at all. If the screens went dark tomorrow, if the feeds fell silent, if every notification stopped at once, if the rectangle in your hand became, at last, only a piece of glass, who, exactly, would be left in the room? And would you recognize him?